I'd like to go ahead and start by introducing our panelists today. Today we have with us Jay McCoy. Jay McCoy is a Lexington-based writer and visual artist with deep roots in Eastern Kentucky. Currently, he fills his days as a contract editor and medical credentialer. Jay earned his MFA in creative writing from the Bluegrass Writers Studio at Eastern Kentucky University. Active in the writing community, I'm getting some comments that people can't see anything or hear anything. Hi, can people not hear me?
I can hear you, Melissa, and I can see the screen with Jay's thing on it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just want to make sure. I'm getting some comments that people can't. I'm going to continue on with the conversation though. It says, please rejoin if you cannot hear. Okay, thank you. Jay earned his MFA in creative writing from the Bluegrass Writers Studio at Eastern Kentucky University. He's active in the writing community. He leads Q-Munity, a queer writing class at the Carnegie Center. He co-founded the Teen How and Talk to the Sun reading series and served as a lead writer for the Our Breathitt project to help preserve stories and build pride across Breathitt County. Jay's writing has appeared in several anthologies and journals. His chapbook, The Occupation, was published in 2015, and he is editing the forthcoming 2020 Lexington Poetry Month anthology. Could everyone make sure that they're please be muted? Thank you. Welcome, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We also have with us Dr. John Coleman. Dr. John Coleman was raised in Eastern Kentucky and is the co-founder and president of the Faulkner Morgan Archive, which collects, preserves, and promotes the LGBTQ history of Kentucky. Coleman was a James Still Fellow at the University of Kentucky, where he received his doctorate in history in 2014. He often lectures on queer history and was a consultant for the Kentucky LGBT Heritage Initiative funded by the National Park Service. Coleman's book, Anywhere Together, A Queer History of Kentucky, is forthcoming from the University Press of Kentucky. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I kind of wanted to set up how we plan to do this today. So I think what we'll do is I'll start off with a question, and then we'll get the process started, and then we'll go from there. Anybody can use the raise hand feature, and we will go and ask their questions as we go. I'm going to go ahead and turn on our captions as well. Okay, all right, we'll get started. So the first question I thought we'd start with is, can you tell us about your history with the LGBTQIA community? What historical moments do you remember?
I'll let you answer that first, Jay. You probably gained more moments than me.
I'm the old one. I am a bit older than Jonathan, and some of my first actual involvement came when I was in Cincinnati in my late 20s and early 30s, but it was built upon a foundation that was built starting in the early 80s when I was a teenager. Things I remember is, in that first year of high school, there was all of this stuff about the moral majority out there. Billie Jean King was outed because of a palimony suit brought by her secretary, Marilyn Bennett, and she lost all of these sponsorships for being a lesbian in the tennis world at that time. And also, we started seeing word of this gay cancer, which would become what we know as HIV positive and AIDS today. And then throughout the 80s, there were a few moments that growing up, I grew up in Hazard and Pikeville. And so one of my introductions to queer life was actually through PBS. And PBS had a series that began in, I think it was 82, called In the Life. And it ran, I think, until in the teens with it. But it introduced me to things like PBS actually broadcast on In the Life with the 87 Gay and Lesbian and Bi March on Washington. They also had a special on PBS that showed the AIDS quilt when it first started. And one of the most moving things for me was through PBS getting to see the documentary and artistic piece called Tongues Untied. And, you know, going past those when after college and going into my first professional position, I was working in Evansville, Indiana, and began working with the American Red Cross as an HIV/AIDS educator. Excuse me. And there I worked with the probation and parole department for a couple of years, going into halfway houses and going into some of the jails and then some of the release centers to actually do education in the early 90s. It was also then that we started seeing things like Sean and Pedro's commitment ceremony on The Real World. And so I saw that live rather than on a streaming later on. And soon after that, I ended up in Cincinnati. And in the 90s in Cincinnati, I was active in what's known there as the Imperial Sovereign Queen City Court of the Buckeye Empire, or the ISQCCBE, which is similar to, in Kentucky, you may know the Imperial Court of Kentucky, which is a fundraising organization for queer charity organizations throughout the region. And I actually served as president of the board for the court during Reign 11 in Cincinnati. I don't do drag myself, and so the board is the sort of the background, sort of the office workers of the organization there. Other things I remember or events that I witnessed, I remember the everything with Matthew Shepard in '98. That was frightening. And then the early 2000s, there was like this slew of everything, with things being banned, things being accepted, you know, things being legalized, you know, Defense of Marriage Act, all of these other things that just really started moving all over the place. And so those were interesting to see. And then again, at this time was when teaching with the Carnegie Center and being involved with some of their gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual writing contest. we determined to go ahead and do a writing group that focused on that, and were able, through some grants, to be able to continue offering that class free of charge. And so that class will be starting up again later this year as well. With us, I'll put that little plug in there. And then the last thing I would say, as far as my role within the community, I've always been sort of a talkative person, and always talking about my own personal history as well as group history, both as a queer artist as well as a queer Appalachian. So I can talk to you about queer, I can talk to you about Appalachia, and that's a lot of what I do.
Thank you, Jay. I want to make sure we have enough time for some questions too. So I don't know if does anyone have any questions before we continue on with this conversation? If you do, please raise your hand and we'll get to you. I don't see any hands raised right now. Okay. Dr. Coleman, would you care to give your perspective on some of the historical moments that you've personally experienced?
Sure. And being as young as I am, but I have still, witnessed a number of important moments for the queer community, not only of Kentucky, but for the nation. And that's really a testament to, what exciting times we live in. I too am from Eastern Kentucky, right on the border of West Virginia. And my first encounter with anything queer was probably AIDS. And that was, as a kid, learning that Oprah had come to my hometown to do a community, town hall talk about a man who'd gone into the public swimming pool, that I lived a mile away from. And people knew he had AIDS. And this becomes a huge national thing. Now, I was too young to remember this, but I remember as a kid hearing stories about, when Oprah came to town. It really wasn't until college that, I sort of came out to myself. That's a long process. And I left. I got the chance to go study in London. There I saw my first drag queens, had my first boyfriend, went to my first gay bar, all of that. So I came back to Pike County a little more well-versed than I was when I left. And I knew going into my graduate work that I wanted to do questions about sexuality, questions about gender, and that's really what I focused on. Thinking about some of like the big shifting moments, of course, for me, 2015, when the Supreme Court, allowed for same-sex marriage, that would have been a big one. But also, the election of George W. Bush, that was a big one too. 2004 constitutional amendments, appearing on the Kentucky Constitution, defining marriage. So some pretty big events, even though, they're so recent.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask our panelists concerning LGBTQ plus history? Anybody? You can use the raise hand feature. Yes, Stephen White, please.
Yes, I'd like to know, was there an equivalent in Kentucky of a Stonewall situation where the police came in and were very violent and that the community had to fight back?
Oh, I think there's a couple of ways that one could answer that question. One, Kentuckians were at Stonewall, the event in New York, including, in fact, one of the first people to write about Stonewall was an Eastern Kentuckian named Clarke.
That's good. That's good.
The when it's still the Sheridan Square riots. But police violence in Kentucky was, a tremendous and a constant threat and fear. One of the sort of pre-prepared questions that we were asked regarded what was the first documented LGBTQ organization in Kentucky, and that's debated. But both of them were around 1970 with the Gay Liberation Front in Louisville, for example. That house was raided by the police. The private homes of individuals were raided really often. In Lexington, a famous queer artist named Henry Faulkner in 1966, his home was raided, and he and everyone in the house was charged. One of the most compelling incidents, I think, happened in April of 1970 in what is now the bar complex. At the time, it was called the Living Room. And the police had been there undercover for a couple of nights. And then on April 7th, I believe it was, they came in and they arrested the 4 drag queens who were performing. One, she was trans, what we would call trans today. She lived her life as a woman named Tiffy Ross. One was a person who we might today call trans, named Lee Angelique, who would have a long drag career in Lexington. Lee's boy name was, all of their boy names were used in the newspaper the next day about the arrest. And Lee, who worked for the city of Lexington, was fired. After the queens were arraigned, they were supposed to appear for a court date, but something happened in between there. And the story goes, the story Lee told is they went to the home of Sweet Evening Breeze afterwards. Sweets, from the 1920s on, was a very famous character in Lexington who did seem to wield an inordinate amount of power for a Black queer person. And Sweets called the judge that the queens were supposed to appear before, and according to Lee, threatened him with some sort of action that only Sweets could do, and the charges were dropped. The queens never did have to appear in court. And from that day, the Queens celebrated that event as their Bastille Day, their sort of Day of Freedom. And that is the last, as far as I know, incident of Lexington police raiding a gay bar simply for being a gay bar.
I look forward to your book very much.
Thank you
for that. I'll look for it on Barnes and Noble then. Thank you. Appreciate it. You betcha.
There was a question in the chat, and it says, is there any moves that you're aware of to get LGBT plus history into the high school or college curriculums? And he says without making it as an elective, so more of like, a specific requirement.
I'm not aware of anything on the state level. I do know of it happening, though, from queer teachers, from queer educators, from allies. My work with the Faulkner Morgan Archive, our goal is to save and share Kentucky's LGBTQ history. And so we do often get requests from teachers, from professors to incorporate, asking for material, asking for stories to incorporate in their courses. Simply because I think of my own personal connections as an academic, these typically do come from college professors. I know there's one historian of Kentucky who works at UK, who works at Georgetown, who often incorporates queer history within her courses.
Great. So I think we have another question. Jerry?
Hi, can you hear me first of all? Okay. I'd like to get some feedback on how you see the designation of HIV as the queer disease. The reason I ask is I worked during the 80s and 90s at the mental health clinic in Belglade, Florida, and was closely associated with the HIV center there. And the CDC looked at Belglade as almost ground zero for the heterosexual transmission of AIDS. And I always thought that that was kept after the initial shock undercover, and that this disease was then used as a way of keeping gays, keeping in their place, because they didn't want that information being released that there could be heterosexual transmission. I'd like to hear your response to that.
I can address that, some of that. Just I think that is still in the conscious of the country, that HIV and AIDS are still looked at as a gay disease. Even if we look at I never would have thought early on that we would be seeing PrEP medications being advertised in the middle of primetime television. And if you notice, most all of those are either queer people that they are targeting with their marketing, or communities of color, which goes to perpetuate that HIV and AIDS is not only queer, but also people of color. Yeah. Because, and I think that goes back to that beginning of things that, we had a president at the time, in Ronald Reagan, that wouldn't even say AIDS when the disease began, when things were really at a peak in New York. And once things became manageable, and I'll do that in quotes, in the early 2000s, we don't hear a whole lot still today about HIV and AIDS with it. And I think some of us in the community are sort of sitting back during our current pandemic, having flashbacks to the beginning of, I hate the term AIDS crisis, but that's the best thing to describe it, in that time frame of the 80s and 90s, of how much was going on within the community to try to get things done, and nothing was happening from outside with it. So I think there's still that stigmatism that hangs on, and that we just see it more and more with it. That I think I'm just repeating now, but yeah, I definitely see that.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat that said, what would your response be to people who object to required LGBTQ history as part of a K through 12 curriculum?
Well, I know what my personal response would be. And this is really something, when it comes to history, being taught in Kentucky's K through 12 classrooms is something I'm simply not very familiar with. Only sort of on the periphery as someone who does public history, not only for the Faulkner Morgan Archive, but also, more Kentucky-related history in other forms. And getting history taught in K through 12 curriculums is a really tough thing, just general history. But the thing is, my response would be the power of this history. I was sitting with an editor for an article I was getting ready to publish. Very, well-respected historian, who doesn't do queer stuff, but was interested in this article. And she said something that I thought was very powerful. She told a personal story about a young man who was queer that she knew. And she said, and I wonder if a history like this would have saved his life. And I think that is the power of doing LGBTQ history, especially in a place like Kentucky. Kentucky, in the national sense, is so important to the queer history of the United States. Kentucky is often sort of trotted out as an already known narrative, as a trope. There is a reason why Kim Davis in Eastern Kentucky was the county clerk who was sort of picked out of obscurity because of her views on gay marriage. And that's because she came with an easily established narrative. If you said she's from sort of like the big-bellied sheriffs of the civil rights era kind of narrative. And so for queer children in Kentucky schools, what would it mean to them to learn about, the fact that there has been a number, right, of important queer Kentuckians who have made extraordinary impacts both within and outside of Kentucky, right? That this is not a story that is relegated to New York or San Francisco, or that this is not a story that includes you, because it does, right? Queer history is Kentucky history, and Kentucky history is queer history, right? And so you deserve the right, and all marginalized communities do, to feel safe, to feel included, to feel celebrated in the story of your community.
Representation matters. No
Right.
matter what representation, across the board, representation matters. Absolutely. Could you kind of give us some insight, and if anyone else has any additional questions, please, feel free to raise your hand, but could you give us some insight into why it is important to know? I mean, we were talking about, yes, representation matters, but, who are some notable historical figures that are important that people should know about?
Well, I think it's always important, no matter what heritage we're talking about, whether it be our queer heritage or our Appalachian heritage, or any heritage with that. It's good to know where you come from and to understand your foundations and your beginnings, so that when we do begin repeating, or when we come to those stages where the things are happening again, knowing your history gives you resources. I look back on, especially within, being an artist, I want people to know Keith Haring, David Wojnarowicz, Mark Doty. I want people to know Hart Crane, to know that Whitman had relationships with men, to know about queer history. I also, speaking of representation, as an HIV positive man who has been HIV positive for well over 10 years, I want people to know, especially Keith Haring and David Wojnarowicz. David Wojnarowicz, especially for his outspoken advocacy with HIV, to know Marlon Riggs, to know Michael Callan, to know Audre Lorde, to know all of these different artists who have that tracing to the queer community.
That's such a great question. Thinking about sort of individuals, because there's so many who contribute in all kinds of ways. Some of being specifically focused on Kentucky, like if I just had to pick somebody, like learn this person, this is someone who can sort of give you a broader view of queerness in Kentucky, this sort of past story. I would probably pick two guys that we don't know very much about, C.H. Poindexter and Frank Moore. And so these were two Black men who in, I believe it was 1909, all the way in Western Kentucky, Caldwell County, were arrested and charged with sodomy. They were caught somewhere, somehow, we don't know the details, in the midst of oral sex. And so what these two men will do is they will challenge the sodomy law, basically on a technicality, that they weren't actually committing sodomy, that they weren't having anal sex, and therefore it's not sodomy. And it goes to the Kentucky Supreme Court, and gosh darn it, those justices are extraordinarily frustrated because they know Poindexter, they know Moore are correct, that sodomy actually doesn't include oral sex in the Kentucky statutes. And so these two men get away with it. So there's more questions than answers when it comes to this story. You have to think about the context of where these two men are. Poindexter, Moore are in Caldwell County. It's 1909. The previous years, those were the Black Patch Wars, in which tobacco farmers are trying to sort of unionize, gather together in order to protect the price of their tobacco. And of course, the Night Riders come in, lots and lots of violence against these tobacco farmers. A good number of whom were Black, and racial issues were, central to the Black Patch Wars. So were these two men, selected out because of their involvement in trying to, protect their livelihoods, protect their incomes as tobacco farmers in Caldwell County? Lots of questions there, but it goes into some of the bigger aspects of sort of queer history. It's ties to things like economic justice. It's ties to things like racism, misogyny. It's ties to things like ruralism. And also, it's ties to the power of the state. This sodomy law, will actually sort of lay dormant for a while after the Poindexter, Commonwealth v. Poindexter. And in fact, oral sex and sex between women would technically be legal in Kentucky until 1975, when the penal code is reformed, and sex between women, oral sex between same-sex partners becomes illegal. And the sodomy law will stand until the early 90s, thanks to the justice work of another rural, poor Kentuckian. His name was Jeffrey Wassen. He was a nursing student. He was from Stanford, and he was caught in an undercover police sting behind the bar complex at 224 East Main Street in Lexington, charged with attempting sodomy. And he challenges the law, and it takes 6, almost 7 years for these lawsuits to make their way to the Kentucky Supreme Court, Court of Appeals. And Kentucky will find that, yeah, this sodomy law is unconstitutional, that it violates the Constitution's assumed rights to privacy and equal protection. And Kentucky will be the first state to decriminalize same-sex acts after the advent of AIDS, and it starts a snowball effect. Other states are watching this. So activists in Georgia, activists in Alabama, activists in Texas will bring up similar cases. And the Texas case will make it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 2003, using the very same arguments built here in Kentucky, the US Supreme Court will strike down sodomy laws across the nation.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions? If not, I have one to ask. So I want to give other people an opportunity to ask. Okay, so could either of you touch upon the history of the LGBTQ flag? So I know there is a pretty long history with that, I believe, and I'm not familiar with it myself, so I'd love to hear some insight on that.
Sure, I'll chime in here. I believe the first time that the pride flag, sort of the rainbow flag, was developed, San Francisco, what was his name? Gilbert Baker, I believe. This isn't something that I necessarily know a ton about. And it's been a flag constantly under revision from the day that it was made. Gilbert just recently died. And one of the neat things that he did, especially as the rainbow flag became more and more prominent, is the fact that he actually, using lawyers and all of that, made sure that his flag could never be trademarked, so that anyone could use it anytime, no one made any money. And so this sense that this would become a flag for everyone. And of course, it has altered, dramatically since the 70s when it first appeared, and was the precursor for a number of other community flags. More recently, you're starting to see flags that include chevrons or extra stripes to help us focus on a more inclusive intersectional community. The ones with chevrons, it's the pride flag in the background, then chevrons are, I believe they're black, brown, pink, blue, white. And I think that's called the progress flag, pride flag. That helps us focus on members of our community that may be through intersectionality because of their racial identity, because of their gender identity, because of their HIV status, that may be particularly marginalized or left out of conversations within the LGBTQ community. So it's a good change.
Yeah, and throughout the history of the pride flag too, that was one of the things with the progress flag has done is there were all of these flags that represented different parts of the community. There was the trans flag with the pink and blue and white. There's the asexual flag that was a yellow background with a black circle. There was, a flag for every different piece of the community. And that progress flag that Dr. Coleman was mentioning brings all of that together, with the black and the brown in the chevron representing diversity and representation. And then the colors of the trans flag are also incorporated into that chevron. and the colors of the flag, the main background of the flag itself, are not representative of different sections or groups of the community, but different values. Like green is for nature, yellow is, I think, sunshine or strength. There are, different colors represented, different strengths of the community.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. It says, do you ever visit Eastern Kentucky often? And if so, what emotions or sense of belonging do you feel?
So, all of my folks are still back in Pike County for the most part. I don't really know how I feel about about a lot of that. One, sort of a sense that being from Eastern Kentucky makes me feel more like I should have feelings of association or feelings of belonging. To me, I never felt Appalachian until I left Appalachia, which is a pretty common, stereotype that people say. So I never really thought about it. It was when I had to live outside of Appalachia and sort of think about myself as an Appalachian, in response to non-Appalachians that, I've really even started to ponder the question. And how it relates to sort of queer identity. Appalachia, Mary Gray, an academic who worked in Berea, in her book Out in the Country, she talks about sort of rural queers, Appalachian queers are never supposed to exist in Appalachia, right? And Appalachians are never supposed to exist in queer spaces. So there are people always out of place. And Appalachia has been seen as this nadir for queer folks, and many times in ways that hide the possibilities that are available for queer Appalachians. I grew up so super queer, like, boyfriends in Sunday school, that sort of thing, and never a word. Like, no one ever brought it up. Like, it was just sort of like a kind of thing. And I was thinking, man, if I had been that gay living in somewhere else, I probably would have been absolutely tortured. But I wasn't. And people are always kind of, I don't know, I think they're always kind of looking for a sad story when they find out you're gay and from Eastern Kentucky. And there are, of course, a lot of sad stories, but there are sad stories everywhere. And so there was someone that I've written about, Clarke, who I believe I briefly mentioned. He was at Stonewall. He and his partner started the first weekly gay newspaper in the country in 1969 called Gay. And they were, at the time, the most famous homosexual couple, in the world. And this allowed Lige a huge audience and the chance to write a lot of stuff. And he's in New York. He's living in Greenwich Village. He's right in the middle of the gay ghetto. And he's actually really critical of some of this urbanization of queer identity. What he saw as, this argument for essentialism in gay identity. And he wanted a sexuality that was more like the sexuality he grew up with in Heinemann. And so he makes these arguments about, true sexual liberation is found in the hollers of Knott County more than in the streets of Greenwich Village. That is, of course, not the way that the gay liberation movement has remembered the story. But it's a really powerful conversation to think about other forms of sexuality and the things that we can glean from these experiences. Lige talks about growing up in Heinemann as sort of a sexual ideal. He doesn't romanticize it. There are obvious problems there. But he recognized that he was able to grow up with a bit more freedom than sort of the more stifling things he found in the gay community in New York. And in some ways, I really identify with that. While, yeah, it's hard to grow up anywhere queer, but yet still in those environments, there are places of real power.
Thank you for that. I think we have one last question from Derry Pryor.
Hi, I was actually going to type it in the chat, but it got a little long, so I don't know if you have time for me. But my question is about terminology. I noticed you use the word queer a lot, and I have my oldest is non-binary and doesn't live here in Kentucky, lives down in Florida where we're from. And one thing that they have told me is that they don't like the word queer very much, you know, their circle of friends and their community down there. And there's other terminology they don't like. They do not like being called an NB, short for non-binary. They're very, very staunch about that. And as this community grows and changes as an ally, I always try to be conscious and aware of how I speak. And I'm not sure if there's a really good answer for this, and I get tripped up on saying the alphabet word because I just every time I try to spit it out, it comes out wrong, and I'm always worried that I'm going to offend someone. And I guess the question is, what is the best way to make sure that you're using or keeping up with the terminology that's the most appropriate and you're not going to be offensive? Because that is always my biggest fear.
I think the best thing is to do, and hi, Derry.
Hi, Jay.
The best thing, the thing that I do, especially in any setting of, say, teaching a class or working with people I don't know, or when I meet people within the community that I don't know right off, it will be asking, you know, just like it has become second nature class and class I have, is asking participants what pronouns they prefer. It's also the first class of community that I do at the Carnegie Center for any season is talking about just that issue, because within any group of people, there's going to be those who embrace queer as this all-inclusive term and others who think it's an outdated term. There are those who find it very offensive. And so it's really opening that communication the best way we can, and we're going to make mistakes, and giving ourselves that grace and giving others that grace to, when if they use a term that we don't subscribe to take that moment and say, I appreciate that, but my preference is not to use that term in reference to me.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I believe we are at the end of our time, and I thank you all so much. And I want to thank our panelists so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing and providing so much information. We're very thankful for your insight. I did want to remind everyone there is a session evaluation in the chat. If you could please do that, complete that before we leave. But again, thank you all so much, and we really are grateful. Thank you so much. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.